Howdy folks, quick word of warning that there will be spoilers today. So the other week I realised that I was really keen on going through the Hills Have Eyes movies again. I have seen all of them once before, a few years ago. I think I binged them over the course of like a week, albeit with my brain firmly switched off. I will switch my brain on this time though, so that I can properly evaluate them. I'll take my time with them a little bit more this time, but I've always loved this series as a concept. The first one, at least, was directed by Wes Craven. This was his baby originally. I think he wrote the first film. He's more known for Scream and A Nightmare on Elm Street, but I definitely prefer this to A Nightmare on Elm Street. I've never been the biggest Freddy Krueger fan. So when I think of Wes Craven and my personal appreciation for the man, it's mainly because of both Scream and this series. Probably the biggest reason why this series has never quite had the fame of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Well, there's two reasons actually. Firstly, from memory, this series doesn't really have that one knockout masterpiece film. You know, I think all of the films in this series are good, unless I'm remembering them wrong. Certainly this first film is very good, but I don't think any of these four are absolutely superb, you know, proper horror classics that everybody loves. So there's that. Also, this series doesn't have that big famous horror villain. It doesn't have that identifiable character like a Freddy Krueger or a Jason Voorhees or a Ghostface or whatever. We've got 6 cannibals, I think, in this first film, and I can picture them all very vividly, having just watched the film last night, but I still can't put names to faces, even now. They've all got names like Pluto and Mars and things like that, but they're not really characters that you would have posters of on your wall, or you wouldn't buy them to play in Dead by Daylight or anything like that. So that's another reason why I don't think this series has quite hit the heights of other horror franchises, but as a concept I love it. I mean, it's not just the cannibals that are a threat in this film, but they are the main threat. I mean, they are living in the Mojave Desert, and it's an area where most people don't go into because the American Air Force, presumably they've put signs up around this general area for miles around saying don't drive down here, because they like to test aircraft at low altitudes, but the occasional car still turns down this bit of highway anyway, and that's when the cannibals come out of the hills and swoop down to get themselves some fresh meat and presumably strip the cars for parts so they can build their next shack or whatever. But it's not just the cannibals that's a threat in these films. You've also got the military, potentially. You know, our protagonists could stumble into Area 51 or some secret military base and have soldiers going after them. There's also the possibility of exposure and dying from thirst and a lack of food, because it's no joke breaking down in the middle of a desert. If you don't have phone coverage or any means to get out, then you might die even if there's no cannibals. So lots of different threats. It's mainly the cannibals, at least in this first movie. I don't think the military angle gets tapped into as much as the films go on, which is a slight shame. But this is why I've always said, though, that The Hills Have Eyes would potentially be a great TV series. I mean, they're turning a lot of horror franchises now into TV shows. You've got Chucky and Friday the 13th coming up soon. Hills Have Eyes would be a great one because there's so many different threats facing people who get lost in this area of the desert. It's not just the cannibals. It just so happens that in the film series, it is mostly about the cannibals. I'm sure that one of the later Hills Have Eyes films, there's like a toy village with waxwork models that the military, that they used to experiment dropping bombs on them, a bit like that in that later Indiana Jones film. But certainly there's nothing like that in this first movie. It's mainly just about the cannibals and the danger of exposure, and there's spiders and snakes everywhere and stuff like that. In terms of actors, there's only really Dee Wallace in this film who I recognise, and I'm not even sure she would have been that well known when this came out, because the other films that I know her from, like Cujo and The Howling, they came out in the 80s, so probably she was an actress just on her way up in this. It's mostly unknowns. I think there are 6 protagonists in total and 6 cannibals, so it's a nice even match that you get once the starter gun goes off. The villains in this are introduced pretty much straight away, and I wondered if that would annoy me by the end of the film last night, because my natural way of doing this film would have been to have kept the villains back for maybe half the film and then introduce them in the second half. A bit like the structure that you get in The Descent, for example, but Craven goes the other way. He gets the villains in there pretty much from the get-go, albeit he staggers their introductions somewhat. But I've got to hand it to him. I think the way that he does it actually works, mainly because he doesn't overuse any of the villains. They get just about the right amount of screen time. None of them become too annoying. There was also the potential with a film like this, having a family of cannibals, for the villains to end up a bit like the villains in some of those poorer Texas Chainsaw films, you know, the black comedy ones where as an audience you're asked to sort of laugh along with the villains and when they're chopping people up and having all that banter with each other. And I just found that approach to some of those Texas Chainsaw films really annoying. But thankfully in this film, at least, there's none of that. There's no little comedy moments thrown in when the villains are talking to each other, you know. At no point during this film did I find myself liking any of the villains. I constantly was in a state of just wanting them to die as soon as possible. Individually, there's no standouts, I'd say, and this goes back to what I was saying before about there being no villain that you can latch onto from this, you know, somebody who you really remember being really frightening. I mean, the main guy, I guess he's sort of terrifying. He reminds me of the Toad Cutter from Mad Max, strangely. He's just got this gruff sort of post-apocalyptic look to him. And I love that little cut he's got in his nose. It's gruesome, but it just looks cool for the character somehow. Then we've got the Michael Berryman villain, the bald guy who's very recognisable, both as an actor and a character from this movie. I think he's made it onto the DVD covers of some of the Hills of Eyes films. There's also a guy who's got this really evil look on his face. He eats a budgie halfway through this film, but the expressions he puts on, they're just so over the top. But I'd say he gets the most screen time in this, I think. And then we've got Ruby, who is a really welcome character in this film because she's somebody who's good. She wants to break away from her family. It does stand to reason that amongst this feral group of people, there would be at least one person who would grow up with a conscience. So I like the fact that she's in there as a kind of wild card. And it made me wonder if actually the set of good characters could have done with their own wild card, somebody who's not very nice, you know, amongst the people at the car and the caravan, but we don't go down that road. But Ruby's a cool character. All of the villains are pretty decent for the most part, the ones who get a reasonable amount of screen time. Collectively, the villains remind me of a little bit of Khan's henchmen from Star Trek 2 so much. Just the way that they're dressed, it's like they've come from the same costume department. I almost expected Khan to walk out of a cave and say, "We've been trapped in the Mojave Desert for 15 years, thanks to Kirk." But that doesn't happen. But I think the villains in general have been drawn a little bit better in this film than the protagonists. Now, don't get me wrong, I always wanted the protagonist to win in this film, as it should be. I was always on their side. I desperately wanted them to survive. But individually, I don't think that there are many good characters among the good characters. There's no potential Laurie Strodes or Ash Williams among this group of people. There's no horror icons in waiting. The blonde woman in this, not Dee Wallace, the other one, she's really annoying actually. She screams a hell of a lot. There's also an old woman who Bible bashes a hell of a lot. Dee Wallace herself is, for some reason, married to a guy who looks about 10 leagues lower than her. He looks like one of Harry Enfield's Scousers from one of his sketches from the late 80s or something. He just needs a shell suit, although that wouldn't have worked in a desert environment. I kind of liked the ex-cop character, the older guy, who looks about 60, but even though I liked him in the beginning, I liked his take charge approach. By the end of his run in the film, he kind of annoyed me because being an ex-cop and somebody with a gun, I feel like he should have at least taken one of the cannibals down with him. He just has a really lame ending in this film. I just feel like he acts in a really naive way for somebody of his pedigree, so that was a little bit disappointing. The film's outstanding sequence comes just after the halfway point when the cannibals launch an all-out assault on the caravan in the dead of night. It feels really fluid and believable, this series of events. It's really nerve-wracking watching how it plays out. None of it feels choreographed or drawn up on a storyboard. It just feels like a perfectly believable set of kills that happen, mostly on the good side, because, you know, they're not used to guerrilla warfare in the dead of night in the same way that the cannibals are. But yeah, there are some really brutal deaths to sit through, not in terms of the gore, but just in terms of how shocking and sudden they are. The only caveat I have about the nighttime sequences is that the area in the desert is a little bit too brightly lit, given the very limited light sources they have. But I didn't notice this until I watched the commentary track, because somebody on one of those tracks points out that, yeah, if this had been real, they wouldn't have been able to see the desert floor quite as easily as they can in this film. The light only would have stretched out from the caravan by like 10 yards or whatever, but you don't want Alien versus Predator Requiem in this film, I suppose, where it's just too dark to see anything. So I'll forgive the film for that. I do have a more genuine complaint, though, when it comes to the final act. So the following day, when it's daytime again, the survivors from the previous night, they come up with this elaborate scheme involving a cable to set a trap for the main villain, and the idea is he'll step in it, the loop will close, and then they'll drag him across the desert floor. But this is way too elaborate for me. I don't think these people, after being so traumatized by the previous night's events, are going to come up with something like this, you know, something that Macaulay Culkin would come up with in Home Alone or something. It's not in sync with the gritty, down-to-earth film we've had up to this point. It's just a bit silly, and it actually reminds me of something that happens in another one of Craven's films, the first Nightmare on Elm Street. An excellent film, no doubt, but towards the end of that film, there's a whole passage of scenes where Nancy starts to plot ways to take down Freddy, and that gets a little bit of a Home Alone vibe just for 5 or 10 minutes. It's like Craven makes the same sort of error twice in 2 different films. But I like the first Nightmare on Elm Street film, apart from that one little thing, and I mostly love this film, apart from that one little thing, because once that caravan blows up at the end, everything's forgiven about the cable, and you get a good fight involving a snake or something, and we do finish strong, ultimately. It's just a shame about that bit with the cable, which personally doesn't quite work for me. The credits roll a little bit too quickly, I suppose. I would have liked to have seen the 3 survivors walking down the highway and just reflecting on what they've been through, but I guess you can't have everything. I might have had Ruby chasing after them as they're leaving the area, but I think for most people they won't really care once the credits roll. But I love the film overall. It's got such an old school 70s sort of vibe to it. It does feel slow burnish at times, but you get all those classic kind of sound effects that you don't get on the more modern films, but no doubt when we do get to the reboot films, the more modern ones, those films will have their own strengths we can enjoy. So before we wrap up, I'll quickly show you the version of the film that I've got for this. Here is my Arrow Blu-ray copy of The Hills Have Eyes, and it's a really good edition, this. It's packed with features. The film looks good, I'll mention that as well, but that's a given with anything with Arrow's name on it. But there's so much packed onto this. It's got 3 audio commentary tracks. I've watched one of them, which is the one with Wes Craven and Peter Locke. Yes, Wes Craven has a commentary track for this. It's a real treat. There's another track that has some of the actors from the film, Michael Berryman, Janice Blythe, Susan Lanier and Martin Spear, and a third commentary track by academic Mikhail Koven. And there's also a documentary about the making of the film, something else called Family Business, an interview with actor Martin Spear, something to do with the composer, some outtakes, alternative ending. That might give me what I want, actually, now that I think about it. Trailers and TV spots, all the trimmings as well. It's absolutely packed, everything you could want when it comes to The Hills Have Eyes. So yeah, very happy with that. And I don't think it's even that expensive. I think I paid something like £12-13 for it brand new, which honestly for a disc like that is not bad at all. Right, let's get to the bag of terror and find out how I'm going to score this. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 out of 5. Excellent movie. I would have gone to 4.5, but for that daft thing with the cable. But very happy with the film. This is a great start for our Hills Have Eyes review series. I will be moving on to part 2 very shortly. I don't remember that one being anywhere near as good as this one, now that I think about it, but we'll see how that goes. Until next time, cheerio, bye-bye.